The telegram arrived at the German High Command on June 8, 1944, 2 days after D-Day. It was a routine intelligence summary from agents in neutral Portugal, reporting American shipping movements through the Atlantic. The analyst who read it did something unusual. He laughed out loud, then marked it low priority and filed it away. The numbers were absurd. According to the report, the Americans were claiming to have transported over 150,000 men across 3,000 miles of ocean in a single operation, along with thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of tons of ammunition, and enough fuel to supply an entire invasion. Impossible, he wrote in the margin. Allied propaganda. Except it wasn't propaganda. It was exactly what had happened. And the fact that a trained German intelligence officer couldn't believe it, even when presented with evidence, reveals something fundamental about the greatest logistical achievement of World War II. The Germans never imagined the United States could move an entire army across the ocean because nothing in their experience suggested such a thing was possible. They were still thinking in terms of European logistics, European industrial capacity, European geography. They were fighting the last war while America was inventing a new kind of warfare entirely. The Atlantic Ocean in 1942 was not a highway, it was a killing ground. German U-boats prowled in wolf packs, sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. In 1942 alone, over 1,600 Allied vessels went to the bottom, taking with them millions of tons of cargo, fuel, food, and weapons. The U-boat crews called it the happy time. Hunting was so good that submarines returned to base with empty torpedo racks and stories of ships burning on the horizon as far as the eye could see. For the German High Command, this seemed to validate their strategic calculations. The Atlantic was a moat that protected Fortress Europe. Even if America wanted to send an army across, they'd have to run a gauntlet of submarines. The ships would be sunk, the supplies lost, the men drowned. Any invasion force that somehow survived the crossing would arrive scattered, under-equipped, and vulnerable. The whole enterprise seemed logistically fantastical, like trying to build a city on the moon. And from a certain perspective, they were right to be skeptical. Moving an army across an ocean wasn't just about ships. It was about coordination on a scale never attempted in human history. You couldn't just load soldiers onto boats and hope for the best. You needed a system, a way to synchronize the movement of men, equipment, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, spare parts, and 1,000 other necessities across thousands of miles of hostile water. You needed ships designed for specific purposes, ports capable of handling massive throughput, a logistics network that could track and manage complexity that made peacetime commerce look simple by comparison. No nation had ever done anything remotely like it. Not the Spanish Armada, not Napoleon's continental system, not even the British Empire at its height had attempted to project force across an ocean on the scale America was planning. And yet, in conference rooms in Washington and London, American planners were calmly discussing doing exactly that not once, but continuously, for years, building up armies in Britain and North Africa, and eventually France, until the sheer weight of men and material crushed Nazi Germany. The Germans looked at these plans when their intelligence managed to glimpse them, and saw delusion. They saw a nation that didn't understand real war, real logistics, real limitations. America was 3,000 miles away across an ocean full of U-boats. How could they possibly sustain an army in Europe? Where would they get the ships? How would they protect the convoys? What about winter storms, equipment failures, the 1,000 things that could go wrong? What the Germans failed to grasp, what almost no one grasped, initially was that America wasn't planning to fight with European resources. They were planning to build an entirely new logistical infrastructure from scratch, one designed specifically for transoceanic warfare. And they had something no European power possessed, industrial capacity on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. In 1939, American shipyards built fewer than 100 merchant vessels. By 1943, they were launching ships faster than Germany could sink them. The secret was a man named Henry Kaiser and a design called the Liberty ship. Kaiser was a construction magnate with no shipbuilding experience, which turned out to be an advantage. He wasn't constrained by traditional thinking. He looked at shipbuilding the way he'd looked at building dams, as an assembly line problem, not a craft. The Liberty ship was deliberately simple. A basic cargo hauler, 441 feet long, powered by a simple steam engine, capable of carrying 10,000 tons. Nothing fancy, nothing elegant, just a steel box that floated. But Kaiser's genius was in how they were built. He used prefabrication welding instead of riveting modular construction. Components were built in factories across America, shipped to shipyards, and assembled like giant Lego sets. The results were staggering. In 1941, it took 244 days to build a Liberty ship. By 1943, Kaiser's Richmond shipyard could launch one in 42 days. In one famous publicity stunt, they built the SS Robert E. Peary in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch. It was a piece of theater, not sustainable production pace, but it made a point. America could build ships faster than Germany could sink them. And they did. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards produced over 2,700 Liberty ships, plus hundreds of faster Victory ships, plus tankers, troop transports, escort carriers, destroyers, landing craft. The sheer scale was overwhelming. By 1943, the U-boat war was lost, not because German submarines had been defeated in some climactic battle, but because they were simply drowning in targets. They could sink ship after ship and still lose ground as American production outpaced losses by wider margins every month. But ships were only part of the equation. You also needed a system to organize what went on those ships and where it went. This was the challenge handed to a logistics staff that included some of the most brilliant organizational minds America could produce. They had to invent, essentially, a global supply chain before the concept even existed. The organizational miracle began in a nondescript office building in Washington, where a colonel named Leroy Lutz was handed an impossible task: figure out how to supply an army that didn't exist yet, fighting a war that hadn't started, in locations that hadn't been decided, with equipment still being designed. Lutz was a logistics officer, which in the peacetime army had been a backwater specialty, the people who ordered boots and counted rations, important but unglamorous. Now suddenly, logistics was the war. And Lutz approached it with an accountant's precision and an engineer's systematic thinking. He created something called the balanced load plan, which sounds boring until you understand what it meant. A balanced load meant that every ship carried not just cargo, but the right cargo in the right proportions. If you loaded a ship entirely with ammunition, it arrived useless. You had bullets but no guns, shells but no artillery pieces. If you loaded it with tanks, you had armor but no fuel to run them, no spare parts to fix them, no ammunition for their guns. A balanced load meant each ship carried a cross-section of everything an army needed: weapons and ammunition, vehicles and fuel, food and medical supplies, engineering equipment and communications gear. More than that, the loads were calculated mathematically so that even if ships were sunk, and ships would be sunk, the surviving vessels still delivered a functioning army. Redundancy was built into every convoy. Critical supplies were distributed across multiple ships. The system could absorb losses and keep operating. To make this work, Lutz and his staff developed a classification system that categorized every item the army used into supply classes. Class A was food. Class 2 was clothing and individual equipment. Class 3 was petroleum products. Class 4 was construction materials. Class V was ammunition. And so on. Each class had planners who calculated consumption rates, shipping priorities, storage requirements. The system was massive, Byzantine, and it worked. But even the most brilliant planning meant nothing without ports to receive the ships and infrastructure to distribute supplies inland. And here, the scale of the American effort becomes almost surreal. In Britain, the buildup began in 1942. American forces needed bases, depots, airfields, hospitals, training grounds. They needed places to store mountains of supplies that were crossing the Atlantic in preparation for an invasion date still years away. The solution was to turn much of southern England into a giant military warehouse. By 1944, there were over 1.5 million American personnel in Britain, more than the population of many British cities. They occupied over 100,000 buildings, built or requisitioned. Depots sprawled across the countryside, Quonset huts and temporary structures covering thousands of acres. One depot near Ashurst covered 640 acres and could store 60,000 tons of supplies. Multiply that by hundreds of similar facilities. The British watched with a mixture of amazement and mild resentment as American efficiency transformed their island. Supplies arrived in a steady stream, Liberty ships docking at Liverpool. Southampton, Bristol, unloading cargo that was immediately sorted, inventoried, and dispatched to depots. The Americans brought their own forklifts, their own trucks, their own cranes. They operated 24-hour shifts, floodlights turning night into day as cargo flowed from ship to shore to warehouse with industrial precision. And it wasn't just supplies. The Americans were building the infrastructure for an entire Second Army on British soil. They constructed airfields by 1944. There were over 100 American airbases in England, each requiring runways, hangars, barracks, fuel storage. They built hospitals with thousands of beds, ready for casualties that hadn't happened yet. They built rail lines, improved roads, dredged harbors. The Germans knew something was happening. Aerial reconnaissance showed the construction. Intelligence reports described the buildup, but they couldn't grasp the scale. Their analysts estimated American strength in Britain at maybe half what it actually was, because the real numbers seemed impossible. How could the Americans be supplying 1.5 million men across 3,000 miles of ocean? Where was all this material coming from? The answer was Detroit, and Pittsburgh, and Gary, Indiana, and thousands of factories across America that had retooled from making cars and refrigerators to making tanks and artillery pieces. American industry in 1943 was performing at a level that had no historical precedent. Consider a single factory, the Ford Willow Run plant near Detroit. Before the war, the site was farmland. Henry Ford built a factory there so large it had its own zip code, a single building over a mile long, containing 3.5 million square feet of floor space. It was designed to mass-produce B-24 Liberator bombers using assembly line techniques adapted from car manufacturing. At peak production, Willow Run completed one B-24 every 63 minutes. Workers on 8-hour shifts could watch a bomber begin as components at one end of the line and roll out as a complete aircraft at the other end before their shift ended. The plant produced over 8,600 bombers during the war. That's one factory, making one type of aircraft. Multiply that across the entire American industrial base. Chrysler built tanks. General Motors built trucks, aircraft engines, artillery shells. Shipyards in California and Oregon built landing craft. Textile mills in the South made uniforms, tents, parachutes. Pharmaceutical companies mass-produced penicillin. Food processors packaged millions of ration kits. The statistics become numbing. America produced 300,000 aircraft during the war, 88,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. But those numbers missed the real miracle, which wasn't just production but coordination. All of that material had to be tracked, shipped, delivered to the right place at the right time. And it was. By 1944, the system was working with clockwork precision. Ships left American ports on schedules, crossed the Atlantic in convoys protected by escort carriers and destroyer escorts, arrived in Britain where the cargo was unloaded, sorted, and distributed. The whole apparatus hummed along, barely noticed except when something went wrong, and things went wrong less and less as the system matured. D-Day, June 6, 1944, was the ultimate test of whether all this planning, all this infrastructure, all this unprecedented logistical effort could actually work under combat conditions. The assault itself is what gets remembered, the beaches, the paratroopers, the heroism and slaughter. But behind the infantry storming Omaha Beach was a logistical machine of staggering complexity. The invasion fleet consisted of over 5,000 ships. Not warships, most were transports, landing craft, supply vessels. They carried 156,000 men, 20,000 vehicles, 570,000 tons of supplies and ammunition, all crammed into an armada that had to cross the English Channel, land on hostile beaches, and establish a foothold fast enough that German counterattacks couldn't throw them back into the sea. The Germans had planned their defense, assuming logistics would be the Allies' weakness. They believed that even if the Allies got ashore, they couldn't be resupplied fast enough across open beaches. Historical precedent supported this. Amphibious invasions required ports, and the Germans had fortified all the ports. Destroy the docks and the invasion would wither for lack of supplies. Except the Allies weren't planning to use French ports. They were bringing their own. The Mulberry harbors were one of the most audacious engineering projects of the war. They were artificial harbors, complete floating dock systems that could be towed across the channel and assembled on the Normandy coast. Each Mulberry consisted of massive concrete caissons that were sunk to form breakwaters, floating pier sections, roadways that rose and fell with the tide. Together, the two Mulberries required 600,000 tons of concrete and 33 jetties stretching over a mile. The concept was so ambitious that even Allied planners weren't sure it would work. The caissons had to be built in Britain, kept afloat until needed, then towed across the channel and precisely sunk to form protective barriers. The piers had to flex with waves but remained stable enough for trucks to drive across. The whole system had to be assembled while under potential artillery fire. Against all odds, it worked. Within days of the landing, cargo ships were unloading at the Mulberry harbors as if they were conventional ports. Trucks drove down floating roadways to collect supplies, drove inland to dumps, returned for more. The flow of material ashore was measured in thousands of tons per day: fuel, ammunition, food, replacement equipment, reinforcements. The Germans watched in disbelief. Reconnaissance showed ships unloading in open water where there shouldn't be a port. Intelligence reports described the floating harbors, but commanders struggled to believe them. It seemed like science fiction harbors that appeared out of nowhere. But even the Mulberries were just one piece of the supply puzzle. Getting supplies ashore was only the beginning. You then had to move them inland, distribute them to the units that needed them, and do it fast enough to keep pace with an army that was hopefully advancing rapidly into France. This is where the Red Ball Express entered the story. As Allied forces broke out from Normandy in August 1944, they advanced so fast they outran their supply lines. Rail lines were destroyed. Ports were hundreds of miles behind the front. The solution was trucks, thousands of trucks running in continuous relay from the Normandy beaches to the advancing armies. The Red Ball Express was a dedicated highway system, marked with red balls painted on signs, where truck convoys ran 24 hours a day. At its peak, over 6,000 trucks were in operation, carrying 12,500 tons of supplies daily over roads reserved exclusively for military traffic. Drivers worked brutal scheduled shifts of 20 hours or more, racing through France in convoys. Headlights on even in daylight to maintain spacing, stopping only for fuel and to load more cargo. The majority of Red Ball drivers were African-American soldiers, serving in segregated transport units. It was exhausting. Dangerous work vehicles broke down, drivers fell asleep at the wheel, the roads were rough and poorly maintained. But the trucks kept moving, keeping Patton's Third Army supplied as it raced across France, keeping the advance going even when logistics said it should be impossible. And still the system strained. By September 1944, Allied armies were hundreds of miles from their supply bases. Fuel was being flown in on transport aircraft because trucks couldn't haul it fast enough. Ammunition was rationed. The advance slowed not because of German resistance but because the trucks couldn't keep up. The Germans, even in defeat, took grim satisfaction in this. Their commanders noted that American logistics, for all their advantages, still obeyed the fundamental law. Armies can only advance as far as their supplies can reach. The German retreat was orderly, their defensive lines shortening, and they believed winter would force the Americans to pause while supply lines caught up. What they didn't anticipate was that the Americans would solve the problem the same way they de-solved every other logistical challenge, by building more infrastructure. Ports were repaired: Cherbourg, Antwerp. Rail lines were rebuilt by engineer battalions working around the clock. Pipelines were laid to carry fuel directly from tankers offshore to depots hundreds of miles inland. The famous PLUTO pipeline under the ocean carried fuel from England to France beneath the channel. By early 1945, the system was running at full capacity again. Supplies flowed from America to Britain to France to the advancing front with an efficiency that matched or exceeded what the Germans had achieved fighting on their own territory with interior lines. The American army in Europe numbered over 3 million men, all of them fed, equipped, and supplied across an ocean, and then across hundreds of miles of war-torn countryside. The German commanders who dismissed American logistical capacity in 1942 were faced with irrefutable evidence. The Americans had done the impossible. They'd moved an army across the ocean, sustained it through a year of combat, and kept it supplied well enough to push into Germany itself. There's a photograph taken in May 1945 in the ruins of Berlin. American and Soviet soldiers meet at the Elbe River, shaking hands, celebrating the defeat of Nazi Germany. In the background, you can see trucks: American GMC 2.5-ton trucks, the workhorses of the Red Ball Express and every other supply operation. The Soviets are looking at them with interest. Some of the trucks bear Soviet markings. What the photo doesn't show is that many of those trucks the Soviets were using had also crossed the Atlantic not to supply American armies, but as Lend-Lease aid. America had shipped over 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union during the war, along with jeeps, locomotives, food, fuel, and raw materials. The same logistical system that supplied American forces in Europe simultaneously kept the Red Army mobile on the Eastern Front. This is the scope of what German commanders never imagined. Not just that America could move an army across the ocean, but that they could do it while simultaneously supplying allies, fighting a separate war in the Pacific and maintaining a civilian economy that barely felt the strain. German war production peaked in 1944, a heroic effort by Albert Speer to squeeze every last tank and gun out of factories under constant bombardment. American production in 1944 was so abundant that the problem was distribution, not scarcity. There were warehouses full of supplies that couldn't be shipped fast enough. The bottleneck wasn't production, it was logistical capacity to move everything that had been produced. In the final accounting, logistics won the war in Europe as much as any battle. The Germans fought brilliantly on a tactical level, their commanders showed genius in maneuver and defense, their soldiers displayed courage that earned respect even from their enemies. But they were fighting an enemy that could afford to lose battles and still win the war through sheer material advantage. Every tank destroyed was replaced. Every artillery piece knocked out had 3 more behind it. Every ton of ammunition expended was matched by 10 tons arriving from the rear. The German army, by contrast, fought with dwindling resources, irreplaceable losses, supply lines that shrank with each mile they retreated. The irony is that German military thought had traditionally valued logistics highly. The Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz wrote extensively about the importance of supply lines and the dangers of overextension. German staff officers trained intensively in logistics, understanding that tactics without supplies was just theory. But the Germans thought about logistics within a European context. They planned for short wars of maneuver where initial stocks would suffice, or for wars on interior lines where rail networks could shuttle supplies efficiently. They never couldn't conceptualize logistics on the scale America practiced it. When German officers were interrogated after the war, many expressed genuine puzzlement about American logistics. How did you do it? The numbers didn't make sense to them. The tonnages seemed impossible, the distances too great, the complexity beyond management. Some suspected the numbers were exaggerated, propaganda designed to demoralize. But the evidence was irrefutable. The mountains of supply dumps they'd seen as they retreated, the endless truck columns. The fact that American soldiers seemed to have everything new uniforms, ample rations, cigarettes, medical care that saved men who would have died in any other army. By 1945, the material disparity was so vast that even German soldiers in the field could see it. Captured American ration kits were prized treasures. A pair of American boots was worth a fortune in barter. The lesson of American logistics in World War II goes beyond military history. It demonstrates what's possible when you combine industrial capacity, organizational innovation, and systematic thinking at scale. The Liberty ships, the balanced load plans, the Mulberry harbors, the Red Ball Express, none of these were brilliant in isolation. They were brilliant as a system, each piece supporting the others, creating capabilities that exceeded the sum of their parts. Jiro Horikoshi designed the Zero to be perfect within constraints. American logistics designers rejected constraints and built a system that could adapt to any challenge by simply scaling up. Need more ships? Build them faster? Need more trucks? Produce them by the hundreds of thousands. Supply lines too long? Lay pipelines and rebuild rail lines. Ports destroyed? Bring your own harbors. This approach had downsides. It was wasteful, sometimes inefficient, prone to excess. American supply dumps at war's end contained enough material to fight for years longer. But waste was a luxury America could afford, and it bought certainty. Commanders never had to worry if supplies would arrive. They knew the system would deliver, even if it meant ships crossing an ocean, trucks driving through the night, and engineers building infrastructure in combat zones. The Germans never imagined America could do it, because imagining it required thinking beyond their frame of reference. It required envisioning a kind of industrial war where production and logistics were unconstrained, but capabilities where the question wasn't, can we supply this operation? But how fast can we scale up to supply it? In museum archives, there are thousands of pages of German intelligence assessments from 1942 to 1943, Analyzing American capabilities. Many conclude that American forces in Europe would be limited by Atlantic logistics, that the U-boat campaign would throttle supply lines, that the invasion if it came would be under-resourced and vulnerable. The analysts weren't stupid, they were working with assumptions that made sense based on their experience. They just didn't account for a nation that would build 2,700 Liberty ships in 4 years, create artificial harbors, run truck convoys day and night across France, and do it all while simultaneously fighting Japan across an even larger ocean. The scale of imagination required to predict that was beyond what European military thought allowed. And so they were shocked. From Pearl Harbor to Berlin, German commanders faced an American military that operated by different rules written by industrial capacity and organizational logistics rather than traditional military doctrine. By the time they understood what they were facing, it was far too late. The trucks kept rolling. The ships kept crossing. The supplies kept arriving. And the war, for all the tactical brilliance on both sides, was decided by the unglamorous calculus of tons delivered and miles covered. The kind of warfare the Germans never imagined and couldn't counter.